Good afternoon and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Serena Peter and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by email dolesab@ku.edu. After the presentation, we will have some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you have difficulty hearing during the program, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers who will assist you. If you enjoyed this program, we invite you to join us next week for Food, the Ultimate Weapon for Democracy on September 28th at 3 p.m. Guest speaker Don Leslie shares the story of how food became a primary weapon for peace in the post-World War II recovery effort, including programs led by President Harry Truman. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now please join me in welcoming Director Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much. Didn't she do a great job with that? So, outstanding. Thank you for coming out. We really appreciate the outstanding audience for this program. Back in the spring, my assistant director, Lawrence Bush, saw Matt and some of these gentlemen and came from lunch and said to me, we have got to have this program at the Dole Institute. So I reached out to Matt, was able to find him, and he agreed pretty much instantly to do it. We worked out a date, and we couldn't be happier to be in this program here this afternoon. Matt celebrated his 32nd anniversary this year. Hardy and Bacon. He's listed in the best lawyers in America and Who's Who Legal, the international Who's Who of product liability defense lawyers. He graduated with honors from KU and undergraduate and in law school. He was just telling me that he found out I was from SEC country in Tennessee, and he was telling me that KU people didn't really care that much for SEC people. That's a little bit extreme.
And you're the exception.
I'm the exception, okay. I said to him, well, Vanderbilt beat K-State this past weekend in football, so maybe that changes your perspective, but at any rate. Matt served as a freelance writer for the KC Star for 17 years and has been honored twice by the Kansas City Press Club. He's also published monthly in the Kansas Bar Journal. His dad is a Korean vet, and that interested him in profiling veterans who are also attorneys. He also wrote a very long piece on the greatest generation and then progressed from there. We're very delighted to have him and his guests. Please welcome Matt Keenan.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Yes. Well, before I begin, I do want to give a heartfelt expression of appreciation to the Dole Institute, to Bill, Michaela Hipke, who's helped me with the PR, and then Lawrence Bush. Lawrence is here somewhere. Lawrence really was the connection from me to assemble this panel, and I'm very excited about this opportunity. Before I begin, I do want to have those, well, obviously we have 3 veterans, Vietnam veterans, but I'm sure there's other veterans here too. John Musgrave, I saw, came in, and he's in the back. Some of you may recognize him from Ken Burns' series. I'd ask all the veterans to raise their hand and be acknowledged at this time. Well, Ken Burns and Lynn Novick have helped bring Vietnam into the public consciousness with the PBS special. But for the veterans who served, they didn't need Ken and Lynn to revisit this subject because they've been living Vietnam every day of their lives. I'm honored to have not only these veterans, but those also in the audience to talk about that audience. It's interesting how I came to this. I knew 3 gentlemen before I had an understanding or appreciation of their service to the country. John Gerstle I knew because he'd been the former president of the Johnson County Bar Association. John's tried probably 200 jury trials in Kansas City and was president of the Johnson County Bar Foundation. And John is an iconic figure in the metropolitan bar community. And I looked at John Solbach I knew because when I was a KU student in 1980, I took a semester and I worked in Topeka. That spring semester, John was a legislator. Among other things, he was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the House. And John, of course, was very distinctive because when you'd raise his name with my fellow classmates, I'd say he's the one that looks like the Amish preacher. Now, Norm Fretwell, I knew because he was at Spencer Fane, and he was a very prominent banking attorney in Kansas City. He was on the management committee at Spencer Fane, and he had a very prominent presence in sort of the building of Kansas City the last 40 years. But it wasn't until I began to work on this Vietnam project, and I was told by others that these gentlemen also had something else in common besides being lawyers, and that is they are all Vietnam veterans, combat veterans. And as I began to explore and interact with each one of them, I found their stories to be absolutely fascinating and worth sharing. And so I'm really excited that we're going to have that opportunity today. John enlisted after starting KU Law School. He was an enlisted man in the Army. He went to Vietnam in 1969 and came back on Thanksgiving Day of 1970. John's reflections are pretty stark when he describes returning to the campus at KU in 1970 and the kind of greeting he received here at that time, and you'll hear some of this on the video that I'm going to show. John Solbach's experience is a little bit different. He enlisted at 18. Now keep in mind, in 1967, he was enlisting in the Marines and he did not yet have the right to vote. John will describe in a video I will show that he had 4 younger brothers and he enlisted so hopefully he would spare them having to go to war themselves. He was a Marine, and he's got some very interesting reflections that you'll see in just a minute. But Norm Fretwell may have the most interesting story. Norm may be the most famous person from Joplin that Joplin doesn't really know. Norm was a graduate of the West Point class of 1966, and if those of you watched Ken Burns' special last night, there were 4 of his classmates that were profiled there, 2 of whom that died in an epic battle that was on the miniseries. Norm was president of his class. Norm was the first captain in his class, which is reserved for basically the highest ranking member of his class. Now, that may not mean a lot to you, but consider that other gentlemen who graduated from West Point who received the distinction of first captain include a gentleman named Westmoreland, a gentleman named Douglas MacArthur, and Robert E. Lee. He was in Ranger School after that, and his leader in Ranger School was a gentleman named Charlie Beckwith, who, if you saw the episode last night, they called him, I think, Charging Charlie, I believe. All 3 of these gentlemen led very distinguished careers as attorneys, but we're here today to talk about their experience in Vietnam and how that has shaped their lives. And at the end, we will have time for questions, and there are veterans here that may have their own experiences that they would like to share, and we would welcome that. So the format today is going to be as follows. I have a 9-minute interview with all 3 of these gentlemen, and we're going to play them in succession. After that, I've asked them to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes on things that are reflections from their experience, how Vietnam shaped their lives. And then at the end of that, we'll have time for interaction with you, questions or comments that you may have. And so very much looking forward to it. So I'm going to start first with John Solbach, play this, and then we'll go to the next 2, and then at that point, I'm going to turn it over to our veterans. So let's see if this...
Back to school for a summer, and then I went to boot camp in San Diego. And after boot camp, I went to secondary training at Camp Pendleton, and then I knew that if I didn't go, somebody else would have to go in my place. I had 4 younger brothers, and I ended up in this remarkable unit that would become rather legendary, with Ripley as the company commander. He joined the unit in early January. I joined the unit later in January, and I served the rest of his tour under his command.
1968?
1967. I went through boot camp in August of '66, and we left for Vietnam in January of '67. I joined the unit about the 18th of January of '67, went out to the field. And each time we saw Ripley, each time he led us in a combat situation, it proved again and again that he knew what he was doing. He was a remarkable leader. He took care of us. There was just something remarkable about it. Assigned to go up to an NVA position near the closer to the Laotian border, up in the mountains, where there was, intelligence said there was a large ammunitions cache. And it was just the company is the one that went to that location.
How many people we're talking about?
Oh, to 180, 200. And we walked, actually they picked us up at Payable, and they flew us to further away from our objective, and then we walked in because they didn't want to tip off the NVA. That's where we were headed. And we walked up jungle trails. I remember going up the jungle trails. There were little pools of blood all the way up because the leeches would get on the Marines' legs. They'd fill themselves up with blood. They'd drop off, and the next Marine would step on them. I was carrying a 70-pound packboard and another 20, 30 pounds of gear. We stopped on the trail at one point, and I backed up against a tree, kind of lift that packboard off my shoulders. And when we started out, I stepped back and looked at the tree. The tree was about as wide as this room. The trunk was about as big as this room. Had those big roots, you know, that came out. And I looked up, and 9 feet off the ground, you could see where a tiger had exercised his claws. You know how cats do. We heard some small arms fire. We didn't know what it was, but what had happened is the point man had gotten to a crest in the trail, and it kind of flattened out, and he stopped there because there was a woman and a baby in that trail. This was a remote area. It was so remote that this is the area where they found new species of large mammals 20 years later. I didn't believe that any human being had ever been in this place before. And here was a woman and almost a newborn baby. And it was just incongruous. He stopped and looked, and then the man behind him came up, and he was looking over his shoulder. We were supposed to be staying 15 meters apart. And the third man came up, and she just stood there and looked at him, and then she turned and started to walk away. They began to walk after her, and she broke into a run. They broke into a run. She dove into a hole dug in the side of the trail, and the jungle opened up with small arms fire. She led them into an ambush. But the ambush was down the hill, and the lip of that trail protected them. It provided them with cover. And they were running, so they went down fast. Sometimes in an ambush, some trigger-happy guy pulls one off before he should, and that bullet creased one of the Marine's shoulder. They all went down on the trail. A big NVA soldier with an air-cooled submachine gun came out of that ambush to kill those 3 guys. And as he got up to where he could get an angle to kill them, Doug McCrum, a rocket gunner who was carrying a 3.5-inch rocket launcher — we didn't have laws at that time, not the kind of laws that lawyers work with, but light anti-tank weapons laws. And his TO weapon was a .45 caliber pistol, and he was in a shootout with an NVA soldier with an air-cooled submachine gun. And the NVA soldier with the machine gun turned around with his on full automatic to cut him in half. And McCrum pulled out his pistol and just began firing his .45, and one of his rounds hit the NVA soldier between the eyes, laid open the back of his head, and he went down on the jungle. The jungle was very thick in places, and we could only go through it using machetes and cutting our way through, and it was hot. And we had a tremendous number of men who collapsed of heat stroke and had to be medevaced. The best ways to travel was to travel up and down stream beds because they would be clear. But the jungle was so thick that when it started to rain, some places where the trees were huge, like the one 20, 30 feet across in diameter, the trunks. And they were very tall. When it started to rain, it would rain for 20 minutes before the first drop would get through that canopy to you. And then when it stopped raining, it would continue to rain for 20 minutes until the rain had all filtered through the trees. So,
what about the wildlife that was there?
We saw signs of tigers from time to time. We didn't The only man we had attacked by a tiger was Tiger Dave, Dave Schwerian, who on the 15th of April, '67, took his squad out to set up an ambush about a mile north of Kalu along a stream bed. We found that exact spot when we went back this last time. He showed us where the tiger had him. And he says that it was time for him to come off watch, and he was reaching over to tap the next guy to wake him up to take over the watch. And a tiger grabbed him and it picked him up just like a rag doll. He weighed 150 pounds. The tiger weighed maybe 600, and just leaped through the jungle with him like he was nothing, and then turned him over on his stomach and took a bite out of his back. When he was in the hospital, ship, the Sanctuary, I think it was, this was a big news deal, and all these reporters were coming in asking him, how he got away from the tiger. And the news reports came out that the tiger had grabbed him by this arm, and he punched the tiger in the nose with his right hand, or his left hand, and the tiger let him go. I asked him about that one time. He says, "No, John," he says, "I don't know why that tiger let me go. I never punched the tiger, never had a chance to punch the tiger. I just wanted to get rid of those reporters." Being in combat and seeing what war is, I came to believe when I came back that surely we would never ever go to war again if people understood what I understood about war and how terrible it is and the sacrifices that the men engaged in it have to make on both sides. It is a very poor way to resolve disputes. And but we forget. And but this country is founded. Our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our laws, those 5 little magic words in the Constitution, according to the common law, that reaches back and incorporates everything from the 12th century that's been decided and written down in England. That provides us with a blueprint for how to resolve disputes without blood in the streets. And as a lawyer, I've had a great opportunity to do that. When political, legal, and diplomatic institutions break down, we go to war. They are meant to keep us and allow us to live in peace. And that's what lawyers are part of.
Okay. Let's see, Mr. Gerstle.
All right, this saga began, I met my wife in Indiana in 1966, and in 1967, following the conclusion of my junior year in college, we decided to get married. And the impetus for that was, well, we thought we loved one another, was a primary consideration, but the other was that we were very sure that I was going to Vietnam, because if you were healthy, pretty certainly you were going to go to Vietnam. The standard in those days was the oldest man available in your draft board. And in 1968, after I graduated, we knew we no longer had deferments, and I wasn't married with either 1 or 2 children, depending upon what applied at that time. So at that point, I knew in my immediate future I was going to go to Vietnam. And I'm sure that that had a lot to do with why we married early as opposed to waiting till I got home, because there was the great concern I wasn't coming home. So we did that, and I went to law school knowing I was going to get drafted, because the GI Bill of Rights indicated that if I left in good standing when I returned from military, provided I did so within, I think, 6 months, they had to take me back. My considerations were that I didn't think I was qualified to get into KU, at least after I got back. I knew I could get in beforehand, because the classrooms were empty. Nobody was there. So I took my chances. So one of the things that I can tell you was universal, and at the time I was there, officially there were 535,000 troops. To a man, everybody had a calendar. And at the end of the day, you crossed off that day. Now I only have 364 days, and you did that every single day until you got to 99 days. You still crossed your days off, but now you were officially a two-digit midget. That sort of gave you some seniority for maybe somebody else would have to do a duty that you might not have to do because you're getting closer to rotating home. And then you got to the magical time of 10 days. When you got to 10 days, we had a code. It was called FIGMO. And I'm not going to say on the camera what that means, but old guys, it's an expletive, which means I got my orders, I'm going home.
Okay.
And at 10 days, you didn't do anything. You hung out in the bunker, you did safe things, you did not put yourself in harm's way intentionally, because with 10 days, you didn't want to risk an injury, even a shaving cut, because if you couldn't pass your physical, when you came back in country, they'd keep you. So you had to leave in good health. So at 10 days, unofficially, you just were exempt from duty to make sure you didn't get hurt. When I first got in country, my area where I lived was very close to a motor pool, and they had a guard dog there named Bull, and Bull had just sired a litter, and my dog, her name was Queenie. I got her, I don't think she was more than 3 or 4 weeks old, and they were going to destroy her because she was the runt of the litter and she had no value for what they were using the dogs for. I really don't remember how I got my hands on her, but I did. And she became my constant companion for the entire year that I was on my tour. And I can honestly say I'm sure she saved my life because I had her on a leash with me at all times. And if I was sleepy or tired, that was my sentry to wake up. But I had Queenie with me for a year, and I wanted to bring her home. So I made all the arrangements to bring her back. And when I got to Cameron Bay, I was told that I wasn't going to be able to bring her back. I was told that I could ship her. She'd be in quarantine in Seattle for a month. But they told me that they weren't letting war dogs out of the country. Number one, they were way too big, and they all kind of died early. And it would be unfair to her to bring her from one environment to the one I was bringing. So I happened to be serving with a gentleman, I still remember his name, a major in the JAG, Tony Bonfanti. And he asked me if I would give him Queenie, and he would take care of her and try to pass her off when his tour was over. And I lost track. Nobody ever kept in contact because that was the deal. We didn't keep in contact. When we went home, and you sort of never looked back. So I'm sure Queenie lived as long a life as she could have, but that was my girl for a year, and she got to be 100, 110 pounds. She was a big girl.
What kind of...
I have to say that returning back to the world, as we called it, from the land of Jolly Green, was very dismaying. Obviously, I was delighted to be home and in one piece, and I was eager to put my life together, but this country was not in much of a mood to help us put our lives back together. When I got back, I could not get a job until a friend of mine, his dad intervened because my friend was a veteran also. But when I was on my own, just basically knocking door to door, two things worked against me. Number one, eventually I was going back to law school, but primarily I just got back from Vietnam. And they didn't distinguish between the message and the messenger. They didn't trust us. They weren't sure whether we were going to explode and kill them or use drugs. It was not very pleasant. And I finally made it through, and 6 months later when I went back to law school, the campus was no less hospitable. The students up there were organized in demonstration on a daily basis. I had to walk past the Student Union every day to get to Old Green Hall, the one where Jimmy Green still resides outside the law school. And I would have to go by 30 or 40 or 50 demonstrators every day, handing out publications and sticking flyers in your face, and they couldn't not know. My hair was long because I didn't get my hair cut very often. I'm wearing a field jacket, which was directly from my military service, and yet here's these kids who don't know anything about what's going on except how they're being directed by the press, or I don't know what all the agendas were. We were treated horribly. At the incoming military bases, frequently they had demonstrations and they'd carry signs, baby killers, pigs. It was not very much fun coming home. In fact, once we grew our hair out and started dressing normally, we didn't really discuss that we'd been to Vietnam. It kind of marked you as being looked down at. I mean, there was no thank you for your service. That's a modern thing. You just stopped telling people that you were in service. And going back to law school was very different. Law school was a job. It wasn't the same feeling I had when I was in school before that. And I have talked to other veterans about it too, just to see if they felt the same way. I really felt very alone, very apart. I wasn't like the people around me. And I don't know whether that was because I was filtering out my experiences and trying to, get through being a law student again. I'm not sure I understand the total dynamic. I just know that I felt really alone. And recently I've talked to other veterans, and they confirmed to me, we were different. I mean, it's just that simple. We were different. And it showed. So.
Okay, one more. Let's see. All right, Norm Fretwell.
I didn't expect to retire as a lawyer, which I did at the end of last year. When I graduated high school, I expected to retire, hopefully, as a senior military officer. And I had the opportunity to do that, but Vietnam changed my life. I grew up in Joplin, loved the Boy Scouts, was very much involved. And when I was 16 years old, the Scouts nationwide had a speaking contest. The subject was patriotism. There are 12 sections of the country that the Scouts are divided into 12 regions, actually. Region 8 was where I was. And I happened to have the good fortune of winning the contest. What was the reward? The reward for all 12 of us was a trip to Washington, D.C. to present the report to the nation for the Boy Scouts of America for 1961 to President Kennedy in the Oval Office. It was an awesome experience for all of us who were 16 years old. We got to meet other dignitaries while we were in D.C., but there was a sidebar, a trip to West Point. And while there, I was able to meet with the Superintendent General William Westmoreland, who later would be the Commander-in-Chief of all troops in Vietnam. During my time there, he had invited me and others, encouraged us to seek an appointment and become a cadet. And I thought that was impressive. West Point is obviously an impressive place. But I wasn't sure. However, I went back to D.C. before I went back to Joplin and happened to be invited to make a speech at the Mayflower Hotel to a group of congressmen and business executives. After the speech was over, my congressman came up and introduced himself. I certainly hadn't met him before, and took me to the Capitol for lunch. Asked me what I was doing, had been doing, and I told him, including a reference to West Point. He then started asking me questions about West Point, and finally just looked at me and said, "Do you want to go?" And I said, I don't know that much of it. I'll think about it. I stayed in touch with him. The next year, I was fortunate enough to obtain another award being presented in Washington, D.C. to me by the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson. This time, my congressman escorted me to the event and again took me to the Capitol for lunch and wanted to talk about West Point. By then, I had decided that I would try to go. And he gave me an appointment, and I went. Not knowing hardly anything about Vietnam. I knew where it was on the map, and I'd read a few things in the paper, but it was still too early before our big build-up there. At any rate,
This was what time? What year was this?
1961. But when plebe year was over and we became upperclassmen, we began to learn a great deal more. We learned that the previous classes, the majority of the cadets, when they became second lieutenants, within a year of graduation, were sent to Vietnam, and the casualties were heavy. As a senior, I had the good fortune of being selected as the first captain of the Corps. There was a tradition that went back a long way to Pershing, MacArthur, Westmoreland, and others, that the first captain would elect to be in the infantry. And I did not want to break that tradition, so I elected the infantry. And my first stop was Fort Benning to become a paratrooper. After that, I went to the Ranger School for 9 weeks, became a Ranger, and then went to the 101st Airborne Division in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, as an infantry platoon leader. That didn't last very long. Within 4 months, I was on my way to Vietnam, still in the 101st Airborne Division, and still an infantry platoon leader.
What year was this?
This would have been 1967.
Okay.
I was there for a year, and I had 3 days to acclimate myself to the climate and to meet my platoon. The 4th day was my first mission, which lasted 47 days, involved a number of firefights, a very large one on the very first day. The tactics that we were using, search and destroy was what it was called. And what does that mean? You look for the enemy and you kill them. Nothing else. No trying to get to the hearts and minds of the people. And we learned very quickly that the South Vietnamese did not want us there. They wanted us to go home because all we were doing was killing people, burning villages, spreading Agent Orange to defoliate valleys. We were not doing anything positive for them. And we weren't staying in any one place long enough to do anything more. We always went through the jungle because the trails and paths were booby-trapped. And that meant we had to use our machetes. And we just never knew what was going to happen. If we had used different tactics, we could have won the war. But among the soldiers, it was often said, General Westmoreland, who was then the commanding general for all troops in Vietnam, it was said that General Westmoreland can't even turn around without calling Lyndon Johnson. The war was run by Washington, D.C. If we had been allowed to do what we were capable of doing, we could have won it. But we didn't. They just kept sending replacement troops to replace the ones who were killed or wounded. And by the time the war ended, almost 60,000 Americans lost their lives. I feel like I ought to talk something about my soldiers. The platoon in Vietnam was usually 30 to 40 men. But several things caused it to be a lot less. Obviously, if someone was killed or wounded, they were removed from combat. And they knew that they had to stick together. There were no problems like you've seen in some of the movies that have been made about Vietnam. Every man knew that everybody had to be on the team and do their work. And every man, most of whom were draftees and did not want to be there, did their jobs. They were brave and courageous, and I'm so proud that I was given the opportunity to lead them. At any rate,
Okay.
the shadow of the Vietnam War, unfortunately, continues to exist. I'd like to read a brief excerpt from an essay recently written by Ken Burns, which I think states what I just said in particularly good language. The seeds of many of the troubles that beset us today, alienation, resentment, cynicism, mistrust of our government and each other, breakdown of civil discourse and civic institutions, were sown during the Vietnam War. Until we find a way to come to terms with this unsettled and enormously consequential event, its ghosts will continue to haunt us. As I said before, the Vietnam War was a mistake, well intended, but a mistake that created a horrible tragedy.
Okay. Why don't we start over this in John Solbach, your thoughts?
Well, I can tell,
Turn it on.
I suppose I can just tell a story, but I guess I should comment. Some people say that the Vietnam War was a waste. Well, newsflash, folks, war is about waste. It's about who can commit the most and who can withstand the most. We committed the most, they withstood the most. We got to the point where we were unwilling to commit any more waste. They got to the point where they really didn't want any more waste committed. They went to the peace table. We got a treaty that gave us our POWs back. Edwin O. Reischauer, a diplomat at the State Department, had written a book in 1955, 56, something like that. He said, if you get involved in Vietnam, you're not going to be able to win in the traditional sense. The best that you can do is bomb them and fight them to a standstill, get them to the peace table, get your POWs back, maybe have a couple of years, but they're ultimately going to come down and take over South Vietnam. He said that again in the middle 1960s, and it's like Nixon took that plan right out of his two books, because that's exactly what happened. Vietnam had a purpose when we went in there, but that purpose disappeared over time. When Nixon opened up diplomatic relations with China, when détente began to break out with Russia, when we began to realize that there was not monolithic communism, the domino theory wasn't something that we had to worry about, the purposes of Vietnam were no longer there. And the only purpose we had in staying there was to support our allies, not abandon our allies who had taken care of us, who had been loyal to us over these many, many years. Was it wrong for us to abandon those people and leave Vietnam? Yes, it was wrong. It was shameful. Would it have been wrong for us to continue the war and kill another 250,000 South Vietnamese, another 60,000 young Americans, another million North Vietnamese soldiers, another 2 million civilians? Yes, that would also have been wrong. Anyone can make a choice between right and wrong. That's easy, although some have difficulty. We have criminal laws for them. The difficult decisions are when you have to make a choice between wrong and equal wrong, or wrong and greater wrong, or wrong and unknown wrong. And we made those kinds of wrong choices. And we might have made other wrong choices, but those are the facts of life. That's the way life is. Have I used up all my time, or do you want me to tell my story?
Go ahead.
Ripley was a heck of a company commander. There's a book, he was an Annapolis graduate. He started out as an enlisted man. He went to Annapolis when he was a corporal. And then he wasn't an academic, he wasn't strong academically. They called the low man on the totem pole the anchor man. Well, he wasn't the anchor man, but he was only one guy above that anchor man. But he went to Ranger School afterwards as part of becoming a recon Marine, and Norm knows what 9 weeks of Ranger School is. It's tough. There were 140 men in his class. Most of them were Army guys, a few Marines. And half of them washed out. He graduated at the top of his class. When he came to Vietnam, he was a captain. He was very well prepared. He was a heck of a leader. He knew what it was like to be an enlisted man. And there's a book, The Nightingale Song. I don't know if any of you have read it. It's about McFarlane and Oliver North, James Webb, and John McCain. And there's a place in the middle of the book where the author speculates that these were among the best young small unit leaders or military men of their generation. But then he goes on to say, except for maybe John Ripley. And many of us feel he was the best company commander in Vietnam. He stayed with us for 11 months. Leadership is very important, and combat experience is very important for survivability and lethality, which are the two things you got to have. He retired as a senior Marine officer at Annapolis. I corresponded with him over 20 years. He used to effervesce about the wonderful midshipman that he got from Kansas. And then in later correspondence in the 90s, he would say that he would lament that the problem with young people today is they're not tough. He says, if we get them, we make them tough, but not without a great deal of effort. After he died, his older sister, she was 10 years older than him. She was born about 1930. She had studied to become a nun, but she was really proud of her son, her brother John. And she would call me up. She lived in Radford, Virginia. And she just wanted to talk about her brother. And she would tell me how proud she was about Ripley's Raiders, which is what they called us. And she wanted to meet every one of them and give them all a hug, and she just told us how grateful she was for everything we did as we were Ripley's Raiders. And she had studied to be a nun, and she was very proud of the fact that John Ripley was not someone that was known for using profanity as a Marine. And how many Marines have you ever met that didn't use profanity? Anybody here meet one? John, did you ever meet any? No? And she said he never used profanity, probably the only Marine that ever did. I said, well, he did one time. And she says, well, when was that? And I said, well, it was the 21st of August, 1967. Well, what happened? What was that? Well, the convoy had come through our position at Payable and gone out on Highway 9 and got ambushed. And somebody heard somebody at the Radio Shack keeping the handset keyed and just whispering, help, help, help. They brought Ripley over there. And Ripley was able to get him to let go of the handset, or when he did let go of the handset, he got a word in and found out that the convoy had been ambushed. They pulled everybody off the convoy, lined them up on the road, and executed them. he had dragged this kid on the radio had dragged a dead radio man underneath a bridge and was asking for help. Ripley immediately ordered all of us to saddle up and get out on Highway 9. He had a platoon already out there. He gathered up his forward observer, his forward air controller, his radio man, the company gunny. They jumped on a Duster, which is a twin 40 anti-aircraft tracked vehicle, and they headed down the road. He figured with that kind of firepower, it's got a machine gun on top, he could handle whatever was there until the rest of his company got down there. And he'd be able to link up with Jack Wright's platoon, and he'd bring in air support and artillery. But when his Ontos, or when his Duster came around a corner of the trail, there was a disabled truck, the dead Army personnel and others laying in the road. And there were hundreds of NVA soldiers running around. He was there with 7 other Marines. And he jumped up on the Duster and fired a machine gun into the NVA soldiers as best he could. And then he saw this object coming towards him. He could see it coming right at him. It was an RPG that had been fired, and it was going to hit the Duster that he was on. He ordered everybody off. They dashed off into some low brush. It provided them with some concealment, but no cover. The NVA knew about where they were, and they were searching for him. And he realized he was in deep doo-doo, as they say. I think his radio man, Jesse Torres, had shipped over. He'd been there almost a year and a half. Ripley, sometimes people carped over the fact that he seemed to volunteer us for every dangerous mission there was. And Jesse didn't say it, but he thought to himself, okay, Ripley, you've killed us. Let's die like Marines, but don't bring any other Marines down here to die with us. Ripley had already called in artillery, and he was on the radio screaming profanity at his platoon commanders into the handset at a whisper. And the NVA, you could see their legs through the bottom of the brush running around them. And one of them leaned down and looked through the brush, and Ripley's eyes met his eyes. And the guy's face lit up like a light bulb, and he was thrilled to death, and he was going to take off and go get his buddies and come back and get him. Ripley said, I'm not going to be taken alive. A classmate of his at Annapolis in '62 up at Cantiana had been captured. They took him into the jungle, staked him between 2 trees, skinned him alive, and then threw his skin back across the concertina wire. And if he was going to die, he was going to take as many of them with him as he could. They only had 1 rifle because all these guys had as their TO weapon a pistol. But he grabbed the 1 rifle, and he had to decide whether to shoot this guy, which would give away his position, or let him go, which would mean he would bring back other people to get them. And he decided he was going to shoot him. This is the one time I know of in Vietnam where the tendency of that M16 rifle to jam actually saved somebody's life. Ripley aimed in at this guy and pulled the trigger. Click. There was no, he did not fire. And he was busy trying to clear that rifle. And an artillery round from what he had called in earlier hit that NVA soldier with a direct hit, and there wasn't anything left except red mist. We fought our way to him for, Jesse was kind of upset that he thought above that, but when he was using this profanity, talking to his platoon commanders, they knew also that he didn't use profanity, and so it revealed the desperateness of his situation without his having to explain it. But we came down the road, we fought our way to him. When you get into combat, the immediate thing that happens is your body gives you a great dose of adrenaline to deal with what you're dealing with. And it just happens immediately. You do what you have to do and so on. On this particular day, we were coming down that road, approaching the place where the battle was taking place. I was a skater. I had men in a mortar that I had to be responsible for. I could see what was happening. I thought I was going to puke my guts out. I didn't. I hurt. Every bone in my body hurt. I didn't think I was going to be able to continue, but I had to.
Neat little box, put it in the back of the closet, and for the most part, Vietnam was done for me. Just don't want it to be a part of my life. Call it good or bad, I just didn't want to deal with it anymore. And that's not possible to do. You can't erase your mind. And then we keep getting into these damn wars. 91 and forward, we don't learn anything. We just keep going to war. And as a result of it, I've become involved in the Veterans Treatment Court with the help of the good judge who's here today. So it's hard to walk away from this. But I wanted to give a few facts because I didn't know them myself. So I did a little internet search, and I don't know if it's fake news or if it's good news, but it's what Wikipedia told me. The French were defeated in Vietnam on May the 7th, 1954, by what was then called the Viet Minh. As a result of that, there was a 6-month moratorium where they had created what's now known and has been known as the DMZ. And you had free passage to go north or south. At the end of 6 months, the door was closed. You had made your choice and you could not change it. Which is why they claim that the duration of the war, which was never declared, was November 1st, 1955, and someone arrived at the date of April the 30th, 1975. Now, for us as soldiers, I believe the end of the war was 72 or 73, but you will all remember perhaps a photograph of a helicopter taking people off the roof of the embassy in Saigon. That's, I believe, April 30th, 1975, when we just closed down that chapter of the war. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, August 10th, 1964. That's when Congress authorized the use of bombing, mining of Haiphong, and I believe that was probably when the heat got turned up on the war. Prior to that, we had advisors there. We did not have big troop commitments, but when the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed, that put the Vietnam War into another phase that ultimately ended up in the buildup to 535,000 men. That was just us. Just the Americans. A couple of other things. All of the bombs in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that we dropped apparently was 7 million tons. That is twice the amount of ordnance that was used in the entire battle or battlegrounds in Europe and Asia in World War II. Just those 3 small countries. And by the way, if my memory serves me correctly, Vietnam is about the size of Arizona, give or take. And I think that if the 3 of us got together, we could probably agree with something. If we got to the Mekong Delta and were given authority to do what was necessary, anything and everything, my gut reaction is we could stand shoulder to shoulder, walk from the Mekong Delta to the DMZ, and that war would be over in 30 days. That was never, ever allowed. Never. I heard search and destroy. By the time I got there, that was politically incorrect. We weren't allowed to use that. It was seek and cordon off. We had to be a little more politically correct.
It was always search and destroy.
It was search and destroy, but we couldn't say it. So, turning away from Vietnam in particular, and looking at myself at age 71 and a half, and beginning my military career just 6 weeks short of my 23rd birthday, I can't even begin to tell you how I can condense that time into the few more minutes I have left as to what effect that had on my life. And this is what I've been fretting about since Matt asked me to be a part of this panel, because I've been trying to parse out what's hereditary and what would have guided my life to this point, and how much of it is from Vietnam. I think I've identified a few things from the Vietnam experience that bring me here today. One of them is getting through basic training, then going on to advanced infantry training, then going through NCO school, and then living in a jungle for a year. I learned that I'm capable of one hell of a lot more than I ever thought I could do. You know, when I made a little fire with 2 sticks in the Boy Scouts, I was beat to hell. I was tired. And I thought that that was the best of my capabilities. But let me tell you, you come through military training in a war, your belief in yourself is what you can do is 100-fold. I don't think any human being really knows what they can do. You think you know what your limits are until you find out you have a much greater capability. When I started law school, I was a student. When I came back to law school, I was a retired combat veteran. I wasn't a student anymore. That was my job. Most people went to law school in 3 years. I went to law school in 2. I didn't have time to be going to school and doing that kind of stuff. We've talked about certain emotions that we have, and of late I've been asking other combat veterans. I've always felt different ever since I came back. When I was sitting in that big lecture room with 150 people, I felt like there was a light on me, that I was different. Not a good different, not a bad different, just different. To this day, I feel different. Those of us who say these simple words, welcome home, brother. I don't know what it means to you, but it means we've read the same book and we don't have to discuss it. We know what it means. It's important because welcome home is something pretty new. And I'll be a little political here. I guess it's my time. When you say welcome home to an old soldier, we appreciate what you mean, but I want you to know how it's received. And it's not you all. How it's received is, where the hell were you 40 years ago? Okay? I needed help. But I found out how resilient I was, and you know, you'll never take that away from me. I was a warrior, and you can't do anything to stop me. I couldn't get a job. Well, I found a job. I didn't get a job out of law school. Not that I was stupid. I did not apply myself. My parents said I was an underachiever. But because I didn't play well with other people, I opened my own store. 45 years later, I'm still practicing law in my own store because I found out what I'm capable of. Human beings can do anything. I remember, I'm trying to tell you how you feel kind of a little bit different. When you're dating, you're trying to find something to talk about other than what did you major in, what bubble gum do you chew, things like that. I could just see going out on a date with a 22-year-old. Well, what'd you do before you got here? Oh, well, you know, I lived out in a little town in western Kansas, and I was the prom queen. And then she said, well, what did you do? I said, well, I fired up a village, and took out about 27 VC, and that's about what I did on Saturday night. How do you do that? You don't. You have nothing in common anymore, and you have to pull back. So how have these experiences guided me? Well, I hope it didn't get perceived as ego, but to me it was supreme confidence. You can't kill me. They already tried. That's been very helpful to me. The other side of it was that it's taken me until the last number of years, and I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it's becoming a grandfather. I never thought I'd do that. I've mentioned this to folks around me. I became worried about what footprint I was leaving for my family to walk in. I wasn't very happy with how I'd lived my life because I think I'd been very hard bitten. When we grew up, we had two choices. Are you going in the military before or after college? Oh, there was another choice. What branch of service are you going in? We didn't have a discussion. We didn't waste any time on, well, how do you feel about the military? How do you feel about the war? We didn't talk about that. It was part of our upbringing. If you were an American man, you went in the military. That's all there was to it. And those experiences serve you for the rest of your life. Now, how can you justify it? The Judeo-Christian ethic says you shouldn't kill anybody. However, you learn something in the military. It's called the mission. You accomplish your mission. And the better you accomplish that mission, the better you've done. Well, the aftermath of mission is how many bodies are involved. How do you square that away? You shall not kill, but in terms of the mission, kill all you can. Well, the military is pretty good at indoctrinating you as to why that's important, because to this day, my life is the mission. Whether it's my next jury trial, whether it's making payroll, it doesn't matter what it is. My entire life is a series of missions. A, it makes it attainable because I can identify it. And secondly, it makes me feel good. I just did something. I identified something that I thought was important to do, and I accomplished it. I completed my mission. That was important to me. I lived my life that way. I actually was going to go back into the Army. This is a small example of military intelligence. Not on my part. I came back, and because I'd been on delayed enlistment, when I graduated law school, I got a direct commission as a captain to go back in the JAG Corps. I would have been a captain over 5, and in those days, JAG officers were exempt from all duties. You only had 2 things to do. Do your job till 5 o'clock and go to the officers' club and have cocktails after that. That's all you did as a JAG officer. So I'm ready to go to Charlottesville. I haven't been sworn in yet. And I said, can you give me an idea of what duty stations are available? Yes, I can. Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and Fort Polk, Louisiana. I said, are you serious? As a heartbeat, in a heartbeat, that's all I got. Here's your bars. I ain't going. And I resigned my commission. Was that a good decision or a bad decision? I'll never be able to know. I think today, for the first time in my life, I believe I have it figured out. 71 and a half years ago, there was a game plan for me that I had no clue about. And every one of those experiences for all these years is what put me in this chair at this very moment. I couldn't have known that till I got here. And so what did Vietnam do for me? It gave me guts. There's a lot of negatives in there. I mean, I'm not going to tell you the negatives. There's 10,000 things I do not want to hear. I don't want to revisit it. I did try to watch Ken Burns last night, and it was very realistic. It was right on. And after a half an hour, I couldn't do it. And these guys saw a lot more than I did, trust me on that. My primary MOS was forward observer. My secondary MOS was fire direction. And thank God I met some guys in the JAG that pulled me out of the field. And I got me a great job. I was the claims clerk for the 4th Infantry Division. Now, I bet you think that's a good job. Well, when we fired up all those villages, somebody had to go out and pay for them. So it was me, my interpreter, and a captain. 3 of us in a burned-out village in the Central Highlands. Again, not good thinking on my part, but you wear a Superman shirt during those days. So I'm at the end of my time, I'm positive, and I'm just going to tell you thank you for listening to me, and I guess remember, you can do it. You've got more in you than you'll never know, and it's the only way to carry through the most difficult situations in your lifetime is to understand there's a huge reserve inside of you, and it took a war to bring it out in me to understand I got more to me. I can do it. Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of all three of us, I'd like to tell you that we consider being asked to be here today both a privilege and an honor. Thank you very much. I'm going to take just a few minutes to enhance what I said in the film clip which you saw a few minutes ago. But before I do that, I want to read something to you. I was going through an old file, excuse me, I was going through an old file the other day, and I came across this briefing packet. You probably can't see it from here, but I was given this in May of 1967 when I arrived in Vietnam. The title of it is Screaming Eagles Briefing Packet, 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division. In the very first section, has a section that's titled, Why You Are Here. I'm going to read this to you. There are 3 points. A, to support the free Vietnamese in their fight against communist domination. B, to preserve freedom and ensure that the Vietnamese people may develop according to their own desires with outside interference and without serving the policies of any other nation. And C, to frustrate communist designs to forcefully extend their sphere of influence in Southeast Asia. That's just another way of saying the domino theory that the Secretary of State had at the time. When my classmates and I first started arriving in Vietnam in the spring of 1967, it did not take us long to realize that what we had been told by people coming from the Pentagon, others from DC, was not true. The place was very different than what we expected. We were asking ourselves within weeks, why are we here? Because we had learned that for the many, many, many years, remember this situation of Vietnam for the United States covered 5 presidents, about 20 years. And for the first half or more, there was a little guy up north named Ho Chi Minh that was determined to bring South Korea under communist domain. And so what was he doing? He was sending North Vietnamese down into South Vietnam to integrate them in the various villages and towns, which there are, I think, thousands of, and convince the locals that communism was the way to go. And our response to that was to simply send advisors for a long time before we really started ramping things up. But by the time we started ramping things up, we learned that the majority of the South Vietnamese people outside of the government and the military favored the Viet Cong. And when that became known, it became clear that the outdated strategies which we had used in prior wars were not going to work and the probability would be that we couldn't win this war. Yet the war was run from D.C., and they kept replacing all the killed and wounded for several years. I think that's criminal. They knew, they were saying behind closed doors, we can't win the war. But yet they continued to put people into it. That was one of the reasons, actually the primary reason, that I resigned from the Army when I had the opportunity after my tour of duty was over. It was a hard decision. I had hoped to be a general someday, but I think it was the right one for me, and I don't regret it. Let me talk for just a second in more detail about things I mentioned in the video you saw. We had three enemies that we were fighting. The first two were the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. We weren't in contact with them every day. Sometimes we went for days or even a week or two without a shot being fired, because we were just hacking our way through the jungle, going in directions we were told. But once we did get into a firefight, it was just organized, chaotic violence, pure hell, and that's what Ken Burns' film is showing you. That's the way it really was. That film is the real deal, folks. And I'll give you a couple of personal examples that, well, you heard somebody talk about Charlie Beckwith. Charlie Beckwith. Well, Charlie Beckwith ran Ranger School when I was there. And he ended up, toward the end of my tour in Vietnam, being our battalion commander. And for some damn reason, he remembered me. And I'd been a platoon leader, and into it about 9 months, and I was promoted to first lieutenant and made a company executive officer. And he saw that, and he said, you're not going to be doing that. You're going to be in my operations department. So, this very, very unorthodox man who was absolutely fearless made me the assistant operations officer for the battalion. He also made me his sidekick. He liked to go out and see battles firsthand when he shouldn't. I'll give you one example. One afternoon, a rather large battle, 2 full companies were engaged with the North Vietnamese in a valley. And Beckwith didn't think he heard enough about it. So he grabbed the sergeant major and he grabbed me and said, get a helicopter. We both tried to talk him out of it. You didn't talk Charlie Beckwith out of hardly anything. So we get in and go out, and as we approach this hill, which we're going to look down from, mortar rounds start coming in from all directions. And I started to tell the pilot to turn around and move back. Beck was, no, we're not going back. Get down there, get down there. And it got when helicopters never landed. They couldn't, they'd be sitting ducks. So they hovered 6, 8 feet, maybe a little more from the ground. So Beckwith jumps out. And he says, get your asses out here, guys. Yes, sir. So we both jumped out, and the mortar rounds kept coming. And I said, what in the hell did we just do? Thank God, in the middle of this hilltop was a Vietnamese grave. They built them in large circles, 12, 15 feet in diameter, with a big mound. But there was a channel around the edge that went down to maybe 3 feet. So we jumped in that. And the sergeant major happened to have a bottle of whiskey. We spent the night. I spent the night with Charlie and the sergeant major sipping whiskey in a Vietnamese grave dodging mortar shells. Another incident I'll mention to you. In the video, I mentioned that on my first day, the 4th day in Vietnam, the first day in combat, I was the lead platoon. And we had gone down this ridge line. This is the beginning of a search and destroy mission. And all of a sudden, we started taking extremely heavy machine gun fire. So I backed up the men, found cover, and we were exchanging fires. But the intensity of what was coming at us clearly overpowered what we were sending out. So I got on the radio, and I spent a bunch of your money. For 3 or 4 hours, I called in more airstrikes, napalm, so close that it went over our heads. And finally, shortly after dark, everything quieted down. So we went back up to the rest of the company. The next morning, the whole company went down to where I had been the prior day. And what did we find? Dozens and dozens and dozens of very heavy North Vietnamese Army bunkers and a lot of mangled equipment, but no bodies. Well, we reported it and then moved on into the jungle. About a week later, we accidentally ran into or found a cave just in the middle of nowhere. And it turned out to be a Viet Cong and North Vietnamese headquarters for that basic area, that region. And we finally got the 6 or 8 people out of the cave, put them on helicopters as prisoners and sent them back, and found an ancient typewriter and a stack of paper, which we also sent back. And among that stack of paper was a report on that battle I was in the first day. Well, I didn't lose a man. We killed over 400 North Vietnamese. And they'd drug them all off like they usually did because of body count. They knew that the American standard for winning in this war was body count, which was stupid. We were killing a lot more of them than they were killing us, but the North was dedicated to winning this, and they just kept replacing people one after the other. We were even told, ordered actually, if we found a Vietnamese grave, to dig it up, count the bodies, and report it as body count, which is horrible. It was wrong. That's just one of many kinds of things we were told to do to make things look better than they really were. Well, Lyndon Johnson and others were telling the American public that we were winning the war. All of us who were out there in the real heat of battle, we weren't. We knew we weren't. Well, that's enough of stories, I think. Let me tell you, though, about the way we dealt with enemies. We had 3 enemies: the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, and the jungle. First 2, like I think I may have said, we weren't into a fight with them every day, sometimes days, a week or 2. And that was very boring, just wandering through the jungle with a machete, cutting branches. But that's what we had to do because we didn't have many of the modern things that, that you have today here. Like all we had were compasses and topographical maps. We didn't have iPhones or computers or any technology. And we had one radio for the platoon that had a battery the size of an Encyclopedia Britannica book, but heavier, and one extra for the week. And we just did our thing. But we had to stay on the absolute highest alert at all times because even if shots weren't being fired, we never knew when it was going to be. One day we had a couple of dogs. We were trying to get to a certain place where we were told there were some American prisoners in tiger cages. And we got relatively close, and I'd spread the men out in a circle, and I stood in the middle behind it, guiding everybody. And about as far as you are from me, out of the jungle walks a Viet Cong with his AK-47 over his shoulder. And we locked eyes, just like we're locking eyes. And thank God I got my car 15 up faster. But I'll never forget looking at that man in the eye and pulling the trigger. With respect to the jungle, that was a horrible place to be. You had to deal with the seasons. Monsoon season was 2 or 3 months a year, where you could almost set your watch by when the heavy rains were going to come down every day. So we were wet all the time. And what did that do? It created a lot of mold, a lot of fungus. And then, oh, by the way, as we're walking through the jungle, there are lots of bushes with big thorns on them, so they scratch your hands and go through your fatigues. And what happens to them? You get infected all over. So what do you do then? Well, each platoon had a medic. And every night, he had a razor blade. And he scraped the infection out of our wounds, put some salve on it, and if he had any bandages left, put a bandage on it. Otherwise, we just went at it again the next day. Fortunately, every now and then, they let us go back to a rear area on the South China Sea where we could lay on the beach for a couple of days and get in the salt water, and that really helped clear the funguses and the infections up. But the jungles were a horrible place, not to mention the leeches. During the monsoon season, we took a leech break every hour because there were trees and bushes everywhere. I woke up one night, I felt something coming down my face. I thought it was a leech, and the blood was just dripping down. It was a horrible place. But the men in my platoon, and I assume in others, suffered through all those conditions, not liking it, just wanting to go home, but not complaining, because they knew we all had to hang together, or maybe none of us would go home. We weren't privy to a lot of information about what was going on back in the United States. We knew the war was unpopular, very unpopular, but we had no idea the level of hatred and anger and other negative feelings that were being developed at home. But upon returning, we quickly learned that the thermometer had gotten real hot. The plane that brought me back took me to California, and as I was walking out of the airport, I was greeted by a relatively large number of protesters that screamed at me, cursed me, and even spit on me. Welcome home. And that attitude prevailed for a number of years, and to some extent may have started something that is still with us today. From Vietnam, I went to Berlin as the aide to the senior general, commanding general of the American sector. And in that position, I had the opportunity to meet a lot of significant people, politicians, businessmen, movie stars, you name it. And none of them were in the military, obviously, but the majority of those visitors came to West Berlin because West Berlin was 108 miles behind the Iron Curtain. And they could say they'd been behind the Iron Curtain and have their picture taken in front of the Berlin Wall and then go home. And they'd usually stay 2-3 days. But they looked down on us. Those of us in uniform, they treated us like second-class citizens. There was no cursing or spitting or anything like that, but it was just the way they acted. Well, I finally filed my resignation for the Army and decided to go to law school. Ended up going to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And there were 20, 25 of us, something like that, who had been to Vietnam, that were in the law school. And the student body essentially ostracized us. They didn't think we were part of them. So we simply went our own way. And then it spread out upon graduation and all over the country. And I ended up moving to Kansas City, Missouri, and joining a large, prestigious law firm. And things quieted down. This was 1973 that I graduated from law school. And the war was pretty much over by then. I think the final shots were fired in 74 or maybe early 75. But when that happened, things seemed to soften and settle down. But there was no discussion about Vietnam. And if the subject came up, people either walked away or just changed the subject. No one wanted to talk about Vietnam. There was this undercurrent that just continued for a long time, and I think is still in part with us. In any event, there were a number of us in the Kansas City area that had been to Vietnam, and we formed a loose group and got together every now and then for drinks or dinner, and decided in the early 1980s that there ought to be a memorial to the 540 soldiers that came from the Kansas City area to Vietnam and were killed. Well, it took us 3 years to get that done. We finally did at 43rd and Broadway. There's a wall with 540 names on it. But we were so disappointed at the number of people we talked to, the number of companies we approached that refused, and basically said, we don't want anything to do with Vietnam, which confirmed to us that this undercurrent was still very much there. Well, I think I've said enough, but I want to say one final thing. The documentary that Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, that's right, I'm sorry, that is now airing on KCPT and other PBS stations, is the real thing. It's not pulling any punches. It's hard to watch. It's violent. It's nasty. But it's telling the truth. Some of it's very hard truth. And I only hope that this film may lead to closure on the dark shadow that still lingers for so many people, that caused a war that was a great great mistake and which caused a colossal tragedy. Thank you.
I see Bill back there. I know we're a little bit past, but you want to offer some remarks?
Why, no, I just want to say, let's take 15 minutes Q&A, if that's,
Yes.
that was your plan, right?
Yes,
Take a little bit of
yes.
Q&A afterwards. If you need to leave, anybody, please just leave as quietly and unobtrusively as you possibly can. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for our student worker with a microphone to bring it to you so that we can get this on our videotape. So Matt, I'll turn it back over to you, and you can select the persons for questions, and our student will go to them.
Well, I know we have a lot of veterans here. Mr. Musgrave is back there. I'd like to hear from any of you, any of the veterans, if they have any observations, comments on what these veterans have shared today. Oh, we've got a...
Hello, should I stand up or sit down? Or
Stand if you wouldn't
okay.
mind, thank you.
Well, I enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1963, went to Vietnam in 1966. I studied Vietnamese in Okinawa.
Can you hold your mic out a little farther?
Is that better?
Yeah. It's better.
Oh, okay, sorry. Well, anyway, I found out a couple of things. One is that when I was in Okinawa, I was an electronics maintenance company. And next to us was a motor pool. And we saw a truck that had hit a mine. The floor was peeled back. There's still some blood stains inside the cab. And we congratulate ourselves in being in electronic maintenance. We didn't have to drive trucks like those poor guys did every day. Well, a few months later, we were riding in the shotgun in those trucks. And, but because I had learned some Vietnamese, it kind of helped us out. We came to a roadblock. This is after in the morning we've seen the Vietnamese Air Force strafe the Vietnamese Army during that little mini revolution that you might have seen last night. And so we came to a roadblock with the machine guns facing us. And the driver, Forrester, a guy from Tennessee, started swearing. He gets out, slams the door shut, starts pushing the roadblock off. It was on wheels, and I got out, started helping him. Air Force MP comes up. He had an M16, by the way. We had M14s. But anyway, he says, "You're going to cause the incident." And Forrester, the driver, said, "If you don't get out of my way, there's going to be an incident of me kicking your ass." And so I finished pushing the roadblock away, and then I realized, oh, maybe I better talk to these guys with this machine gun pointing at us. And so I went up there, and using inappropriate grammar, I said in Vietnamese, "Chúng ta phải đi thẳng." Means what I meant to say was we had to keep going straight. But what I really said to them was we all had to go straight down the road. And that really confused them. Because the Vietnamese, first of all, said, "He speaks Vietnamese." And then they said, "But he's saying we all have to go away." And so then I realized I'd made a mistake. I said, "Oh, xin lỗi. You know, chúng tôi phải đi thẳng," means just us. And he said, "Oh, okay." And so the next time, whenever we went to the roadblock, these guys got out behind the machine gun, pushed the roadblock away, and waved at us as we went by. And but during that time, I was pen pal to a Vietnamese student in Ohio. I met her family. Her brother was one of the pilots strafing the Vietnamese Army. He was in the Vietnamese Air Force. The son-in-law was a wing commander. He was killed the last few days of the war. I got a chance to find his grave. Let's see. 2013 when I went to Vietnam for the third time, and was able to light incense and send it to his daughter, send my photograph to his daughter. But one thing that you all should know is there's Vietnam veterans in Vietnam working to find mines, working to help Vietnamese that have been injured. And so for a lot of the American soldiers and Marines, Air Force, they're still fighting for those people. And I think it's important to remember that there are still Americans that they're still trying to help them. They didn't turn their backs on the country that they're trying to help. So
Well, it's very helpful. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, over here. Sure, yes, that's fine.
My name is Cecil Mashburn. I was there in 1965. I was one of Johnson's TDY men. I'm not going to talk about me because I was a forward controller. The Marine pilots were always lost over land, I'll tell you that. But it was really refreshing to hear your your stories. They're honest stories, and from a lawyer, that's really great. No,
Thank you.
I've been to a lot of seminars because my father was in Vietnam during World War II, and during Section 2 of the Ken Burns story, when they had the coup d'etat, that was my father that did that coup d'etat. And so I've been to a lot of seminars, and many of them are so false on their statements. It's unbelievable, but really, you did a great job. Thank you very much, and thank you for your service. And when I first heard that, and they come up to me and thanked me, I was offended at first. Now I'm accepting it.
I'll work on it.
We did our job. But I was in Air Force. I could read and write.
Other questions?
Well, he jumped out of an airplane that was going to come down anyway.
Thank you for your comments this afternoon. One thing that seems that, just to an outside observer, is that the intelligence that the U.S. had access to or didn't have could have, it seems that was really lacking. There are all these anecdotes of Vietnamese working for the American troops, and then lo and behold, the next day they are coming after the Americans, or they're passing information on. And I was just wondering, was there a severe imbalance in the intelligence?
You want to take that?
Sure.
Norm?
Sure, I'll be happy to. I never talked to an intelligence officer during the whole time I was there, but I was fed intelligence through our company. And as often as not, it was wrong. You couldn't trust anybody. Part of that was when you looked at a non-military South Vietnamese person, you really couldn't be sure who you were talking to. Maybe it was a North Vietnamese that is pretending to be a South Vietnamese. And maybe they provided information to some American that was disinformation, that was fed down the chain of command, and we ended up with it. It was not good. On one occasion, which I didn't mention, I only lost 2 men during the 9 months I was a platoon leader. A number were wounded. But we had information about a certain location, and I was designated to take my platoon and go check it out, which I did. And we were told not to expect any contact within, I forgot where it was, 3 or 4 kilometers. The helicopters took us out. We hadn't gone 300 yards until fire killed my point man and the backup and pinned the rest of us down, wounded 6 or 8 of my guys. And as it turned out, the information that we had been given was wrong. And I tried to find out why, but nobody would really talk. But it was obvious. We had to call in another platoon to help get me out of there, which happened. And when we went up to where the enemy was, they'd been dug in for a while. So the information that we got just didn't work. That's why we had to be on full alert at all times, but even then, sometimes that wasn't enough.
Other questions? Over here.
To expand upon that just a little, do I need a microphone?
Yeah, for the videotape, yes.
To expand to expand on that just a little bit, do you know how the North Vietnamese communicated and the Viet Cong communicated amongst themselves so that they could set up their ambushes and their traps?
I don't. I know they did.
Yes, they did.
But I don't know how they did it.
In International Morse Code. And my MOS over there was a 98 Bravo. Nobody probably knows what that is, but that's a cryptanalyst.
Oh.
And so I was a code breaker and did translations of messages. And we used to get what we called TAC reps. And a TAC rep is something that we know is going to happen based on communication of the enemy. We couldn't provide it. All that information had to go to Washington before it could be disseminated. It couldn't be disseminated. You heard me, and it's exactly right.
Because
Only until I got to the 101st Airborne 3rd Brigade. And the brigade commander would not let Army Security Agency personnel even be with them unless we could communicate directly. And we did that, and that was as late as 70. And we were able to provide actual tactical information that could save lives and change outcomes. That's the only time that I've known of the information that the Army Security Agency provided was used effectively. Because the Viet Cong communicated amongst themselves a lot. And in fact, we used to translate messages from commanders saying that, yeah, send me some scissors. My guy's hair is just getting way too long. Other guys would talk about arc lights, B-52 strikes.
Yeah.
And they'd say, I can't control my men. They're out watching the sky and walking around in circles. So those things were devastating.
500 pounds.
And Washington knew that, but very few commanders knew that.
Oh. We've got, what's this mean? One more question. I think we have it back here.
I want to address this to Mr. Fretwell, maybe. You commented that all of the orders were coming from Washington. But if the military people could have done it, you could have won that war in 30 days. So elaborate.
I didn't say 30 days.
Oh, okay. I don't want to
was my
misinterpret
wild
what you said.
speculation.
But elaborate on what you meant by that.
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
So elaborate, please, on what the tactic would have been.
Oh, I see. Well, we started off wrong. The military seems to have a tendency to want to fight a new war in the way they fought the last war. That never worked in Vietnam. If we had started much, much earlier, before Ho Chi Minh was to get all those North Vietnamese down into the South, if we'd have started closer to the 535 or 40 soldiers which were there at the peak, I think we could have done what needed to be done. But only, though, if Lyndon Johnson would have allowed us to do it. Individual airstrikes sometimes had to be personally approved by the President of the United States. And you can't run a war that way. We weren't taught that way at West Point. And in reality, you can see it doesn't work. What the President and the government has got to do is give general guidance with a general objective and with a few limitations if necessary, but not to be answering the telephone every day or whenever. The military in this country is rock solid, and I'm glad to hear Congress now saying that they're in favor of budgeting more money for the military, because it has been, in my judgment, underfunded for a number of years. We can't afford to let ourselves get behind. There's too many people out there, particularly in China and Russia, that know what they're doing. We need to stay ahead of the game, folks.
Well, this has been a wonderful event. Thank you all for coming, and we will be sticking around for a little bit if you want to meet any of the panel members. So thank you, and thank you all for coming.
Good job, guys.